Now for the type tool. All right, so here's the type tool. We're just going to do normal horizontal type. You can see the properties up here, and particularly important, all the fonts. Below, font size, we're going to go pretty large. Font color, left justified, center, right justified. So, this isn't going to be as important because we're not working with paragraphs. And let's change it to a little bit of a more subdued font to start off. And 72 is pretty big. So you'll see that's highlighted. And I'm just going to use the font tool, click and drag, and highlight that again. And capitalize T, type in Texas. It's not that big, right? No. I'm going to make sure that I'm on this layer. Go back to the type tool. And you can change the font size. You can change the font. So particularly in terms of like changing the font, we might want to put this over here. And again, go back to the type tool. And you can just kind of scroll through the fonts. See what appeals to you. Remember, in most cases, you'll be able to use bold, kind of like that almost, because we're filling in this case. Yeah, that seems to fit. Because we're filling in this case, which means we're filling the type with an image. You want something that's going to be fat. Give you a lot of room. So in this case, even with a kind of thick font like this, we probably still want a bold. Yeah. Okay. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. I want to manipulate this first in terms of size, and then second, maybe in terms of like putting it on a curve. And there's a number of ways of putting it on a curve. One is right here. But let's just look at size first. And the easiest way to do this, beyond 72 points, which is kind of a standard and it's just there, is just go to Edit, Free Transform, or Transform Scale. And you can scale. It's a good habit to just hold down the Shift key to keep the proportions. Okay. And that's not keeping proportions, but it should be. So I'm going to scale this up quite a bit, right? Okay. Let's go to about that. Double click. Okay. Now, if we want to put a little bit of a curve into it, and there's a couple of ways that you can do this. One is you can create your own vector, your own path. And that you would probably want to do initially and type it on the path. But you can always do it afterwards too. In this case, what I'm going to show you is something probably even easier, and that is warping text. Warping text gives you a lot of options in terms of styles. These are all kind of what they look like. If you look at the style, you can try it out, right? Then cancel it. But you do have a good bit of flexibility with this. So let's take this down a bit, all right, to like there. Okay, everything still fits, pretty much. Then horizontal distortion. If you push it in this direction, it's gonna be kind of a little bit stronger on the left. This direction, whoops, this direction a little bit stronger on the right. What makes more sense? Where do you have more room? Yeah, you might want to do it that way. Let it get big, 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 you know. Depends. And then vertical distortion kind of works the same way. We only have so much room. If we go in the other direction, the distortion goes that way. Probably not a great idea. So I'm going to keep it at 0. And again, you can use more than one warp on here also. There's a lot of things that you can do with type in Photoshop. Ultimately, to really get in very deep to manipulating type, Illustrator and probably InDesign too, but particularly Illustrator are the best tools. Photoshop, though, besides going about it this way, which again is pretty simple, but there's a lot of variations possible. There are some basic presets that you can get pretty creative with. All right, so next, what we're going to do is put an image inside of that text. Everywhere where the white is, basically. Again, as with most things, there's more than one way of doing this. I do things the old-fashioned way, and the benefit of doing it the old-fashioned way is really you see everything kind of underneath the shortcut. And I really do believe that showing students kind of the old-fashioned way, you learn more. You learn more of like maybe how to do similar things with other kinds of elements as opposed to just working with text. So basically what we're going to do here is get a selection of the text and then paste an image into that selection. Now, I have an image that I got, again, from the Library of Congress. This might be a little bit small on the height. It's a pretty good size image, but in terms of image height, it might be a little small, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Image size, you can see it's really, over 6,500 pixels. Width, but height only 700, so not that much height. But let's take a big chunk of it. First of all, I want something that'll stand out. I want something that'll stand out here. That background, even though I didn't finish coloring this version, that would probably be like a dull brown. So we want something that's gonna kind of pop with that brown and with the sky. I'm thinking kind of a strong yellow orange. So how do we do that? Let's see. Well, first of all, this is a background. Flat file, it's a background. You can't do anything to it until it's a layer. We can just double click it, it becomes a layer. And now I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation. Very easy to do, and you can play around with it in a number of ways, 3 different ways. So we're going to hit colorize. Okay. We got kind of a reddish hue. That's usually where it starts off. And, you can go all the way through those hues. Again, we kind of said we wanted something that was on the yellow side, maybe towards red. Let me go up on the saturation. Lightness. Yeah, you could go up, you could go down. But we want it to be pretty light. See what it does to push the saturation even more. Yeah, we could push the saturation. So, there it is. Okay. So now, I'm not going to take this whole thing because it's just too long. So I'm going to go from here to about there. Okay. And do a copy, Command C. All right. Now, that's on the clipboard. While that's on the clipboard, you can paste it at any time, but not yet. We need to get a selection that basically is the white letters. Okay. Easiest, most straightforward way of doing that, it basically for a paste into, is just use the magic wand. The magic wand, if you put the tolerance very low, like at 1 or 0, it's only going to select the pixels that are the same as what you click on. So if I click on a white pixel and I don't have contiguous checked, which means the pixels have to be connected for them to be selected. Letters aren't connected, they're separated, so we don't want this to be a contiguous selection. All I'm doing, and even if that was checked, you could hold down the Shift key and select each one of the letters. No big deal. But all we're doing is trying to get a selection of the letters. Okay? I just clicked on anywhere on that white pixel on the T, boom, I have a selection of the letters. And, no matter what color the letters are, generally speaking, you're going to have a pretty easy time getting a selection. Because that selection is layer specific. So you could actually click on what's not the letters, which is transparency, and you would get all the transparency selected. Anyway, so we have a selection here. And now what I'm going to do is it's not a regular paste. And you got to be careful if you do that. This isn't going to work at all like it's supposed to. This is a paste special called paste into, because you're pasting an image into a selection. You're pasting into a selection. So you do a paste into, you're going to get a new layer with that image pasted into it with a mask already made for you to make everything else on that layer transparent. Okay, so there is the image and there is the mask. You can see the mask follows the letters. As you can see, just like I said, we have pretty much right about the necessary amount of horizontal pixels, but the height is a little short. Regardless of that, I'm going to do a little playing around with the image. And in this case, I'm going to do something that, in some ways makes a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do now, I want you to notice something on this layer is that a mask and an image can be connected or linked with a little link symbol or not. Now in this case, I like the way the mask is. I don't want to change the mask. I want to change the image. When a mask and an image is separate, it gives you the opportunity to click on the image and move it around for placement. That's a big deal, especially when you're doing something like this. That's a very big deal. So I'm going to kind of pull it all the way to the end, right? Now what I'm going to do is very similar to what I did with the letters in the first place. I'm going to try and kind of warp the image to match the way I warped the letters. So I'm going to go to Edit, okay, Transform. Look under Transform, we have Warp. And you kind of have the same opportunity, although it's a little bit more freehand, to warp the image kind of however you want to. Now, these are vectors, and if you haven't worked with vectors before, basically you grab an anchor point and go, okay? These are handles that control the curves. Now, it's a little bit easier to do this with the image. In this case, you just have to look for your anchor points. And we're going to kind of curve this up. I'm going to move this down. So we have a little bit of a curve to the image, just like kind of occurs in the letters. That's kind of nice, It's a little bit tricky dealing with the vectors. Hey, if you'd rather not, you can just pop an image in there, right? You don't have to do any warping or anything. Your letters can be straightforward. Your image can be straightforward, and, just do it straightforwardly. I'm going to do that, okay? Now I have that set. And I just clicked on the layer to kind of execute the warp. We still have the original text layer here because this was a paste into of the image layer. So underneath that, hey, if you mess up, you always have your original. So again, this is the image paste into those same shapes that you have, the letter shapes. So now what I'm going to do with that letter layer that you see, and another important thing to distinguish here is when you do type, because it's formattable, a type layer like the one that says Texas right here, okay? This is PostScript, this is not pixels. This, on the other hand, because it was an image pasted into those outlines, this is pixels, which means there's a lot of things that you can do with it. Now, you can't go back and change the font, but I wouldn't think you'd expect to at this point. But, you can apply filters, you can do a lot of things that you can't do when you're working with type. Type layers and kind of normal Photoshop layers made of pixels are two different things. All right? So now what I'm going to do is that mask, I'm going to apply the mask so that the effects are permanent. Go to layer, layer mask, apply. Now the mask is gone, and basically if you grab onto this, you can see this is independent. What's underneath of that is the original letters. We can turn those off, right? And see that this is basically independent type. Now, what remains that we're going to do is you can kind of pump this up a little bit if you want with layer styles. And layer styles are another thing to get to know, that, you know, basically whatever your layer consists of, and that includes type, you can use layer styles. Layer styles are kind of like, to a certain extent, pre-formatted changes. But layer styles are very versatile, and particularly because you can use them with type, they're extremely helpful. So, let's try and finish this up with layer style. Go to layer, layer style. There's a number of things that you can do, and again, layer styles are really versatile. You can use them with any kind of Photoshop layer, type, you know, whatever. So there's a lot you can do within this. Overlays, including imagery, and, you know, to a certain extent, if you wanted to make type interesting, there's a lot you could do just with layer styles as opposed to doing what we just did. But, you know, it's helpful. It's helpful to know that way of doing things. Let's look at drop shadow first. Drop shadow, kind of the most obvious thing to give that type a little extra pop. And drop shadow is right here. Whatever effect you're working on in layer styles, you have all of them listed here. Make sure you click on that, right? And then you should see the controls here. So let's up that opacity. You may not be able to see the shadow right now, and I'm going to move this down here. Even with a strong opacity, because it's right under the letters, so you may just need to move it a little bit, change the distance like this, right? You know, and how dramatic do you want it to be, or, you know, what kind of shadow, how much space do you want. You know, when you put the shadow there, you're describing a little bit of space between maybe the rest of the postcard and the type, illusionary space. So how much of that do you want? You know, do you want it rather close? Then the shadow itself, spread doesn't really affect it in this case, but size will, and size will soften it. You also have up here a blending mode. This is the same kind of blending mode that you can use with a layer, you know, in terms of how a layer blends with whatever's underneath. So if you change this from multiply to overlay, you're going to see a lot more of what's underneath. So you can have a shadow that, yeah, you know, works as a shadow. You can still see, to a certain extent, you know, what's underneath of that also. There's a very light shadow, hard light, So all these blending modes do different things. In some cases, your shadow will disappear, especially with these in this section. In some cases, the effects will be very different in terms of color. So you should explore that. Angle, yeah, you can change the angle. You might want to look at, where's the light coming from in the actual photograph. It's kind of coming from above, slightly to the right. So maybe you want to kind of have the same thing here, above, slightly to the right. Something like that, right? Yeah. Color burn, awfully strong. Multiply is kind of what you would typically use. And we can make that a little bit lighter. Might make a little bit more sense. That's pretty good. Yeah. So, let's look at other things that we can do. You want to give the letters themselves a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more weight, a little bit more like three-dimensionality. They're very flat, like cut out of a piece of paper. But suppose you use like a bevel and emboss. Bevel and emboss gives you a lot of choices to give more of an edge to the letters, maybe even a little bit of three-dimensionality. If you look at this for style, you could use inner bevel, emboss, stroke emboss. You don't want to use outer bevel because that kind of starts to interfere with the shadow. So inner bevel, let's raise the depth so you can see that. Look at the edge. If you look at the edge, you can see it a little bit more closely. Let's change the size. That'll make it more visible. You see the size now? There you go. Depth. Okay. Size. And yeah, you can go, really far with that. Look at those edges, and what soften does is just soften those edges. Let's change the size. Let's stick with something that's very visible, but not too over the top. Depth, we can change a bit like that, but let's keep the depth pretty high. And then down here in terms of shading, that's your light and dark. Use global light. You should probably keep that checked. That means your drop shadow, where the light is coming from for your bevel, that they'll all align. They'll all basically be occurring from light coming in the same direction. So, yeah, that's kind of important. You have your highlight and your shadow mode. You can look at both of those. If you want your highlight mode, the lightest parts that are like up here, the lightest part of the letters, if you wanted them to have a little bit of a different color to them, you could click on this, right? And let's try and use like a little bit of a yellow here, all right? And so I'll move this over to yellow. right? Well, let's make it a little bit more saturated. Okay, right here. And you might see a little bit of a difference there, you know, right there. Um, let's change the opacity, pop it up a little bit for the highlights. So we're putting at 100%. Yeah, you can see a little bit of yellow, not that strong. Try changing this to maybe color dodge. Yeah, that's a little bit stronger. Now you can see the yellow for sure. The same thing with the shadows. The shadows are basically multiply if you wanted to change the color there. Let's say since you're using yellow, why not use the complement? Violet. Makes sense. So if we use the complement of violet, let's try and stay in gamut. It's a good habit to stay in gamut if you can. Violet's a tough color to do that with, though. That's too dark. Yeah, we'll go with this. Okay. And click OK. Now, with multiply, you're not necessarily going to see it, but you can try different blending modes. If you try something like color burn, yeah, nah, doesn't really show up. Darken, yeah, you see a little bit of violet here, right? Put the opacity up. Now you see it. So that purple and yellow gives it a little bit of extra pop. They're complementary colors, you know, especially where the violet and yellow are right next to each other, like there, or here. That is going to give it a little bit extra pop, you know. So that makes sense. Now, what else can you do? Well, I mean, there's a limit. You could do a stroke, but now that this is very three-dimensional, you might not want to do a stroke. It might not make a whole lot of sense, but just to see what a stroke looks like, that's too big. But that's what a stroke looks like. And, you know, you might want to do that with a slight bevel, but not a big stroke with a big bevel is not going to make too much sense. And, you know, here, it doesn't really go with the bevel. I don't think I would use a stroke. Inner shadow is just kind of just like it sounds, you know. It's not going to be there. You can see it, but with everything we have going on, the inner shadow is just not going to make sense. If you try that out with flat letters before you've done all this other stuff that we've done, it might make more sense. Inner glow, same thing. At this point, with the three-dimensionality and the big bevel, it's not going to make much of a difference. Now, the satin look will do something. It kind of changes the way the light works on the letters, gives you a different feel, almost like a soft metal feel. Um, if you look at those two letters, you can kind of see with opacity how this is kind of how it did look. Okay, so we're using black too, which you don't necessarily need to use black. I mean, suppose we change this to more of a dark orange, like somewhere around here. A brown kind of. Let's see how the satin looks with the brown. Yeah, I mean, that could kind of work. You can still see the image, little bit of a satin look. Color overlay, again, that's putting a color on top of what you already have. And now at this point we're kind of doing things over and over again in different ways because we've colored this, but let's say you did want to do that at this point and you want even more, like let's say yellow, right? So we'll pick a yellow, something like that. Click OK. And this is normal. You could do something like, just to make it a little bit softer, maybe an overlay. But again, we're almost doing things now at this point that are kind of contradicting each other, working against each other, like the color overlay and the satin look really, in this case, kind of compete with each other, and they're going to knock each other out to a certain extent. Now, one thing you still could do is a gradient overlay. Now, in a gradient overlay, let's take this opacity way down. You want to look at a gradient, and again, there's a lot of gradients to choose from. But let's say you go from something that's like white to black or transparent to black. Transparent to black would be even better. And these are going to be according to what these are. So this is your foreground color to transparent. So if I change this, like let's cancel this. Oops. Well, we can redo that. But let's change these so black is the foreground color. Let's go back to this, all right? And again, I'll just run through this one more time. Drop shadow, multiply, distance, right? We'll change the angle just so that's down a little bit. Distance like there. Spread a little bit. Soft edge, a little bit of a soft edge, right? Okay. And then we can also, we could use multiply, but like at a lower opacity. Okay. Then we did a bevel and emboss, and that's an inner bevel. Forgot there's 3 looks. Chisel hard. Chisel hard might be a better look for Texas. So we're going to get more depth and a little bit more size. And I don't know, maybe that's chisel hard is too hard, chisel soft. So that's a good size. We'll soften it a little bit. And highlight mode, I think we did two different colors, didn't we? We did yellow. Boom. Boom. Yeah. We did yellow. Color dodge. Yeah. And then we did violet. Ooh. Keep it in gamut if we can. Violet with, I think, a color burn. No, not a color. Is a color burn strong enough? Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of interesting look. Um, and then again, we can bypass all these, but we did do a satin look to this. And instead of black, we used like a kind of burnt orange. Click OK, and we can play around with the blending modes. Overlay, maybe a little bit too soft. Hard light. Yeah, something like that. Okay. Outer glow you wouldn't use because again it kind of contradicts the shadow pattern overlay. We've already got stuff going on in the letters. We don't need a pattern. But gradient might make sense. And let's look at the gradients. If we look here and you look under, these are all gradients with different colors. But let's look at the basic gradients. The second one is your foreground color to transparent, this one. Now that can be an interesting look, right? And you can also play around with the gradient. You know, where it goes, how far the black goes up. You know, it kind of reflects that dirty, you know, oil kind of landscape. So we could lower the opacity of that, you know. The location you can move up and down. You can move, if you move the white and the black closer together, right, you're gonna have a much stronger change. In other words, it's gonna happen in a much shorter distance, kind of from here to here. So you can play around with how that change occurs. You know, this is our midpoint. You can move your midpoint too. That makes a little bit of a difference. But that kind of gives you a lot to work with. Gradient type, solid, noise just gives you a lot of extra dots. So that's that. And this again is 100% opacity. You can always, you know, lower the opacity. Well, we'll keep it around there. Yeah. 50%. Okay. So I like it, you know. Um, so you can work on the letters a lot just with those things. I mean, that's a good amount to do. And you can do a lot with the letters, make them a really prominent feature. Um, and keep in mind, layer styles, they apply really well to type. You can do this with type that's still a type layer, as I keep mentioning. Now, at this point, we're pretty much done. Of course, done for the purposes of this demonstration, because I didn't really finish coloring the landscape, and you have to. But now you should save where you're at. Make sure you're saving it to the right folder. If you're not sure it's in the right folder, do a save as, and I'm going to go to the folder 4217. Make sure I'm saving this, and I'll save this as a new, we'll just make sure this says P1 space Texas, okay? And make sure it's a TIFF or a PSD, and these should be checked. All right. Okay, great. That's saved. That's your working file with all the layers. It's important that you have your layered file with all the layers. And that, of course, needs to be submitted so I can see all the work that you've done in layers. But you also want to have a copy of your file that's a flat file without all the layers. And again, when you do this, make sure that you have your layered file saved first. Now I'm going to go to Layer, Flatten Image, and actually, I wouldn't necessarily have to do this, but I'm just going to do this for the purposes of demonstration, and flatten the image so you have a flat version. The flat version will be a lot smaller in terms of file size. And then we're going to go to File, Save As, and for certain types of formats you can also do export, but in this case we're just going to do a Save As, and we want to save it just in case you have type layers. It's a good idea, you know, when you have type layers that remain type, because someone else may not have all the fonts that you have. So when they open up the file, if they don't have that font, it's going to show up totally differently than how it read to you. And so that would be an issue with me, for example. I may not have the same fonts you do. So you can include the font in your project folder. But it's also good to make your flat copy a PDF, because that will embed whatever the font is. And so that you have your layered working file, and you also have a PDF that is flat. So we save this as a PDF. I'm going to save it in the same place. And yeah, that's an okay. Now you have settings for your PDF. General settings. You don't need to preserve Photoshop editing capabilities because this is just a flat file. You don't need to optimize this for fast web preview. Compression, you don't need compression. So if you click on this, do not downsample. Okay? Compression, none. And that should be fine. Output, security, summary. Yeah, really nothing to worry about. Keep this really simple. Save PDF. Okay? So, there you go. You're pretty much finished Project 1 at this point. And again, you have your layered working version, so if you do want to, you can always go back into that and change things, revise things, do more work.